Anybody who watches this, there is no place in the Bible where Jesus ever said, hey people, we got trouble, send money. No, you got to be willing to sacrifice part of you for whatever needs to have happen for the kingdom. Jesus said, you go into all the world. He'll say to the ones on his right hand, well done, because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. You put a shirt on my back. You doctored my sores. I was in prison, feeling like the whole world had come to an end, and you walked in the door and said, hey guy, I'm here. And kids aren't hearing that now. And they have no idea that that's going to be part of their job. The whole idea now is, boy, I got to get the newest phone, I got to get the newest car, I got to get the newest girlfriend, I got to get, whatever. And it's all what I want. And Jesus said, you want to be happy, you ain't going to have anything to do with what you want.
Yeah.
And we're not getting that taught. And so, we need Cookson Hills places from coast to coast. And people who get up in the morning and say, I got to get to work because I got to make enough money, because there's some kid that's going to be in a Cookson Hills kind of place that's going to need to have a meal today, and part of what I'm going to give in church on Sunday, or what I'm going to put in the mail to send there, is going to be the difference between whether that kid eats or whether he doesn't, whether he has shoes or whether he goes barefoot.
Yeah.
Because we're getting to that time in this nation right now. We don't feel it as much in Talcott, Oklahoma, because we're kind of in that, I call it, we live in the hen's nest. We ain't outside the coop on either coast, and at the edges of the country where things are just going crazy. But there's, boy, the kids have got to know somebody loves them. It comes back to Roberta.
Yeah.
If your heart isn't broken because some kid says, well, it's good to be home, and that's somewhere that they lock them up and control their lives, there's something wrong somewhere.
And if you think about Roberta, like, that's the way our prison systems kind of work now, like, where people will do things when they get out to go back because they have nothing out here for them, and that's where they're going to end up if we don't have that help.
And what's even worse than that is now they're talking about defunding the police. If they defund the police, what's the next thing they're going to do? They're going to defund the prisons. And the prisons are going to open up because there's nobody to keep them in.
Which I think a lot of the prisons are privately funded, so that might be a difference, but...
Well, I think what you'll find out is a lot of that private funding is done because the states say, okay, you take care of that and we'll fund you somewhere else. And so a lot of places that are privately funded get all sorts of tax breaks, etc., because they're in that job. But the whole thing comes down to how beautiful are the feet of the preacher who carries the word of God to ears that need to hear. And in the prisons, it's sad to say that there's some prisons where you have a whole lot higher percentage of dedicated Christians than you do in communities, because they have seen the worst that the world has to offer, and somewhere along the line somebody came to them with the word of Christ and they said, no, that's better than anything I've ever had before. And so some of the really strong Christians are in prisons, but unfortunately they're still in the minority. And so, you know, places like Cookson, we need them terribly. And people need to devote themselves to the idea that a place like Cookson, if we lose them, what are you going to do? Look at the amount of homeless on the street. If there's no place like Cookson, where are you going to put your kid when your kid's got trouble? And, you know, when I started with Cookson, I had been there for 9 years before I ever encountered a single child who was not there because he was from a broken home. After 9 years, we had a boy come, and his biological mom and dad, still married, still in the home, had siblings that were doing fine. I don't know what happened with this one, but he wasn't. But the majority, 99% of the kids that came because there was no mom or dad or both in the home who said, this kid's important. Yeah. Instead, they were saying, this kid gets in the way of me having a good time. And of course, one of the difference that between now and then is in that day, abortion wasn't nearly as big a deal. You didn't find that many being aborted. But now, that's how it's being dealt with. I don't want this kid, I'll abort him before he gets here. And that's even scarier for me. I want to be able to talk to every young woman to say, do you realize that part of you is a picture of God? Because only God gives life. And there's nothing a man can do that can give life to anybody. But you girls can. This business about feminism just drives me nuts, because my thought is, you're talking about importance because you work a job? Ain't nothing more important than mama. And I mean a mama. So not just does she have the kid, but she's that soft place where the kid says, oh yeah, I feel nurtured. But what's just as important is the daddy who walks in the door and the kid says, Dad's home, now I feel safe. They're both together, now I feel loved. That's what Cookson does. Shows a kid, and I used to talk to kids at Cookson when they would talk about something, I'd say, you're so mad at your mom right now because of what happened to you. You're so mad at your dad right now because of what happened to you. What are you going to do to make sure that you don't turn into your mom? What are you going to do to make sure you don't turn into your dad? Do you want to grow up and be just like your mom? If your mom's really special, you will. But way too many times, you're going to grow up and say, I'll never be like that. If you don't have a godly mama. If you don't have a godly daddy, that's one thing I love about your dad. No doubt when Steve Meyer walks into the room, you got a godly dad that takes the job of being dad really serious. That's the most important job he's ever had, I'll bet you, in his mind. Well, he might say being a preacher, but I don't think so. I think, preachers are great, but the first blessing that God ever gave to man and woman, his children. So where does that rank in importance? I've made so many mistakes being a dad, but I've always wanted to be a dad. I've always wanted to be a good dad. And I want every kid to come along to say, I may not be much of nothing else, but I will be a good father. I will be a good husband. I will be a good dad. And that will be one of my main goals in life. And if that's one of the main goals in life, he will be a success.
Yeah.
And a lot of other things. You get me going on that, I can go for days.
No, it's okay. My next question was, what would you tell new house parents coming in? And I think that kind of covered a lot of what you might say.
I think one of the main things, again, show them Jesus. And understand, I realize you read some of the stuff about Jesus and his disciples. There were some times that, it may not have said that on the page, but there were some times that Jesus said to Peter, sit down and shut up. Pay attention. I'm talking to you. And he did it with all of them. From time to time, he got on them about their lack of faith. He got on them about, all sorts of things. Part of being a dad is saying, hey, dummy, do you realize how stupid you're acting right now? You're smarter than that. My dad he made it through high school, but he grew up at a time when education was something you did, but he was a hard-working farmer, and one thing he did not have was a whole lot of training in grammar and good speaking patterns and so forth. Therefore, as growing up, my dad was always saying, boy, I'll learn you a thing or two. I can still remember one time I said, no, you won't. You may teach me something, but you won't learn me nothing. I was wrong. By the time he got done learning me what he was going to learn me, it never occurred to me again that he wouldn't learn me something. Yeah, but yeah, kid needs to know, I will go as far as it takes to keep you out of hell. I'm in regular contact with I remember her as a little girl. She came when she was 15 years old to Oberlin. And I don't know what prompted it, but she came in and she didn't live in our house. She was working with me in the dining hall. She said, y'all can't hit us. I said, sure you can. No, you can't. Try me. You'll get in trouble. I said, one has nothing to do with the other. What do you mean? I said, well, part of my job is do everything I can to keep you out of hell. If I can keep you out of hell, I'll break your leg. And she just never had anybody say something like that to her. And I never even offered to raise a hand to her. She was a sweetheart. But she was busy trying to establish turf, and when she found out that she wasn't going to have any turf on my turf, everything totally changed. And there's a kid's got to know, yeah, you're so important. A lot of people don't understand that they read the story in the Bible about the good shepherd that goes and gets the sheep that's gone astray. And you see paintings of a shepherd that has a sheep around his neck. The reason he has sheep around his neck is because it liked to run off and he broke its leg. So it couldn't run off. He had to carry it. That sheep got used to shepherd and he got close to shepherd. And as a result, he lived. I'll guarantee you, it was harder on that shepherd to carry him. And so the shepherd made a sacrifice to break that sheep's leg, because that meant he was going to carry him for a while. But yeah, when you got somebody that loves you enough that they'll break your leg and then carry you to keep you from getting eaten by the wolves, hey, you got a dad. That's who you got. And yeah, that's so neat to realize that our Lord loves us enough. He'll go as far as he needs to go to bring us back. If he needs to, he'll break our leg to keep us with him. Therefore, he'll let us, he'll at least let us get a glimpse of what hell could be like. That's neat to think that God loves you that much. And then when you realize also that same shepherd said, I give my life for my sheep, and know that he gave his life for us, man, that's the job of a house parent. You want to see how much God loves you? Just look at what that shepherd did for his sheep. Because you will not treat my family like that without me having a big piece of your hide. And I meant that.
Yeah.
That I loved that boy enough that he needed to be wised up. That you can go this far and no further. I always figure that it says in the scripture that God said to the oceans, in fact, God speaking said, I say to the ocean, you go this far and no further. He didn't have nothing to do with gravity. An ocean goes as far as it goes because God says, no, you stay there. You hear about tidal waves and so forth. As far as I'm concerned, that's God saying, okay, go play. And the water goes and just devastates, one side of the ocean somewhere, because God says, okay, you can go someplace else besides where I told you to stay. And it goes and does its thing. Because God's in control of that. But I also think that it has a whole lot to do that as parents, as adults, we need to say to a kid, hey, God says, just like the oceans, you can go this far and no further. And if you look and see what happens when God turns the oceans loose, when God turns us loose to our own, what happens? We are destructive to everything around us. We are destructive to ourselves. And until we're gathered back into the place that we're supposed to be, just like that ocean, everything is crazy. And that's one of the things that I've always said, that everything that it says in the Bible, that's how it is. And if we don't understand that, it's because we're not looking to understand. Because God's very specific about, you may not like it, but you do this, it's going to turn out. It may not always feel good, but when you get done, you'll know it's right. And I've always felt like that's part of my job as the adult to say to the kid, this is how it is. But I am happy that we don't have the corporal punishment provision that we used to have. I know because as a child growing up, I was very rebellious. I was very wild, happy-go-lucky type of, and my dad was very rough on me. And I used to tell people that a spanking didn't do me much good, but an old-fashioned beating would get my attention. And I was one of those kids that needed it. And there was a time at Cookson that a kid had to have somebody who was willing to go as far as the kid says, if you're gonna rein me in, you gotta take me this far, and there needed to be somebody to say, okay, I'm willing. But things have changed now.
Yeah. And I think like it could be good change, you know? I remember times where we had Mike and Isaiah in our house, and they were little boys, and they just grew up rough, like, you know what you're talking about, and they would freak out, but I remember my mom would just gather them up in a hug, and they would be screaming bloody murder like she was hurting them, but she would just hug them till they calmed down, and that's what they needed. They just didn't know that love.
Yeah, well, and that's the case, but there was a time that I can remember my parents saying to me, the reason you got your butt beat is because I love you. And you know, when I grew up, I tell everybody that I was born with nothing and have most of it left, and that was the case. We were poor, and the other thing made a big difference too, because I've heard people say, "Well, any kid that got beat," I'm sorry. Back in those days, a family consisted of anywhere from 4 to a dozen kids. And you don't have time to sit down and counsel with somebody. And the other thing was, in those days, if you didn't do your job, there were other members of the family that were going to go hungry. Because part of your job was you took care of the chickens, you took care of the cows, and if you decided to go off plan, there was no milk, there was no meat, there was no vegetables, you know. And so part of it was, if you don't do this, we all die.
The stakes were higher.
Oh yeah. And I think that with today's civilization, that's one of the problems, is that kids don't realize how vital they can be because the parents haven't said, you are this important. I really like what my son and daughter-in-law do. Their kids are, will soon be 9 and 12. And they have stuff, no, this you do every day. There's no question that's because that enables mom and dad to be able to do the things that they need to do. And way too often now, kids have no responsibility and therefore no sense of worth. How can you feel like you're important if you don't do anything that's worth anything? And that's one thing we did at Cookson. You know, even at the point when you first got there, I think we were still, did we still have the dairy when you guys came, or had we just gotten, okay, that was the last big thing that, because when we started out, when we started in Kansas, I ground my own wheat for flour. I ground my own corn for cornmeal. We pasteurized our own milk. We churned our own butter. We put up, we weren't allowed to can because of state laws, because some people got too lazy with it, and botulism happened, not us, but other places, and so states made it a law, you can't can, you have to freeze, because botulism doesn't grow in the freezer. And so, you know, you'd put up, I can remember, we'd butcher at least 600 chickens a year.
Yeah.
And that took care of a dining hall in which there were approximately 35 to 40 residents eating and we grew our own beef. Well, we continued to do that even after you were there. And so the whole idea was, gosh, there's gobs of stuff for kids to do. And it wasn't, I know that you can remember kids that had to hoe the garden, pile rocks, etc. And of course at Cookson, we had enough rocks. You'd never ran out of rocks.
That's true.
But back there were stalls to be cleaned. There was eggs to be gathered. There were, and so the kids had stuff. You don't do this, there's going to be somebody go without, and that gives a kid a sense of belonging, a sense of worth, a sense of importance.
Purpose.
Yeah. So that's one of the things now that just bugs me about the present Cookson.
I can see that.
Because, you drive by, used to be, well, when you came, the play area on both the 80 and 920 was full of kids. I don't know when it started, but long before they moved all the houses up on the hill, you just didn't see kids outside. And they might have been down at the barn or something, but in the evenings after supper, the basketball court, all the areas out there in the middle at the 80 and there at the 920 was full of kids. A friend of mine said, when I was a kid, we had a playroom. We called it outside. And that's the way it was.
It was, yeah.
When we moved down, there was not a big house that had an air conditioner. Summertime was sweat time.
Yeah.
And there was times that, it was just almost too hot to sleep. And were the Hawkins there when you were there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can still remember him talking about when they first came, the first year they were there. It was in the winter, before they had gotten all the forced air fireplaces in. The only thing you had was that big fireplace in the living room that they later put stoves in the fireplace and so on. Well, the only heat came from that fireplace, and there was no other source of heat. And I remember Mr. Hockett talking about he and his wife slept with their heads pointed toward each other in the middle of the living room. Boys were on this side, the girls were on this side, because otherwise you froze to death. And yeah, things were primitive.
Yeah.
There was lots of, I'll just use the term, suffering. But for most of the kids, it was better than what they had come from at home. And so that's another thing. When we first started, there were just so many kids that were there because their parents came and dumped them. There was one family of 5 that the kids dumped them at the road and said, go up there, and they drove off. And when we were in Kansas, there was a family that they sent the kids. They were 4, 3, 2, and 1. Stomachs were distended from malnutrition, and they came from California. A church out there knew about Cookson. They made the arrangements on behalf of the mom when they showed up to get the kids to place them. Mom was in her bedroom asleep. They got the kids around. She never even came out to kiss them goodbye. And that was not totally an abnormal story.
Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot like it.
Yeah. Family of 4 that showed up. I still remember them telling, one of the boys lived with us. I wasn't there when they came, but when they showed up, there were two boys, and we were at Oberlin, and so they had the two levels, houses, and these boys climbed out of a car that their dad had rented to bring them, and all their goods were in a little grocery sack. And one of them took off running to one house, one of them took off running to another house. In they went, and in a few minutes they came running out on the back porch, and one of them yelled at the other, "Hey, they got beds!" That's the difference between when I started and the way it is now. Because, yeah, the backgrounds of the kids were so much different than even now. I laugh at some of the stuff that I hear in the news about people talking about having life so rough. And I'm thinking, yeah, gosh, most guys that sleep under a bridge have it better than the majority of people in a third world country. So, and you know, this is the civilization that we serve. But the kids are just as lost and bound for hell, regardless of what generation you're talking about. And so, comes right back to Jesus again. Go show them me. And that's the job of the house parent. That's the job of the grandmas and grandpas. That's the job of the school teachers. Got to show them Jesus, because our job is really, despite all the, well, you're in trouble now and you got to pile rocks. We're not there to make them behave. We're there to show them Jesus. Now you got to make them behave in order to, I used to tell people, they'd say, "What do you do there?" I said, what we try to do with the kid is hold him still long enough that God can get his attention. And I really feel like that was our job, is because so many kids hit the door and they were just so, in their mind, they were just blown up. And you had to hold them still enough that you start moving the pieces back in, and them taking a look and saying, "Oh, life does make some sense. This is okay. And the reason for it is Jesus." Don't have nothing to do with laws. Laws never saved nobody. Had to have them so you can keep them contained long enough that Jesus can get hold of them, because he doesn't do everybody like he does Paul and strike them down blind on the road to Damascus. But all of us have some form of that if we've run far enough the other way. And so, yeah, that's the big difference I see, is just the methodology and the philosophy. That's why I say I'm glad I'm old. I could take care of kids today, but I'd have to be very selective as to which ones I could help, because I can't handle some kid that just comes in off the street and essentially has the attitude of "prove it, old man." Only one way you can deal with that, and that's extremely harsh. And most kids today can't handle harsh. It breaks them and shatters them to the point that they can't be held. So there has to be other ways that they're contained. And what goes on now, to me, makes no sense, but it works with the kids.
I don't look like for you when you were at Cookson?
Well, since I was spent the majority of the 28 years, I think I was 16 of them, or 17 of them at least, in the kitchen. So when we started at Oberlin, I told people I was a 24-hour day cook because the houses did not have kitchens. There was no way for them to cook at home. And in fact, it was against the law for them to cook in the house. And so I provided, now they didn't eat in the dining hall Sunday morning and Sunday evening, but I was in charge of making sure that they had the food to eat. And so 5 o'clock at least I was up, had had breakfast on the table at 6:30 because they had to leave for school at 7:45 and they still had other stuff to do once they got done with breakfast. Did lunch for the people on the place because our kids there went to public school. But the people, the adults and any child that was in trouble, is what I'll put it, got to stay home and eat with us.
Yeah.
They still had to have lunch, and so we had lunch in the dining hall at noon. Supper, and because we did so much from scratch, like I said, I ground my own flour, the whole business, and so a typical day for me was at least 13, 15 hours. And that's why I tell people, you go into this idea that you're going to make money, you're going to be disappointed in a hurry, because there ain't enough money to get me to do this job on any level. But no, you did it because you love the kids, and yeah, you hit it early, you went hard all day, and you slept hard. But I can also remember having stuff and getting up when we were living in the basement of the dining hall. There were times I'd get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and go up and either take something out of the oven or put something in the oven because we had some big shindig that we were getting ready for. And but the same thing too, if we had people who would come and visit, stay, and they might not get there until 8, 9 o'clock at night. And I'd get a call, hey, we just had a family of 5 come in. You got anything in the dining hall they can eat? And so I'm up fixing a meal for somebody who just got there, and it's 9 o'clock at night. That didn't happen often, but you had to be ready for it. Yeah. And so, yeah, it was just, in his books, I loved Louis L'Amour Westerns. And his characters, various ones of these characters would talk about, we worked from can see to can't see. And that's kind of the way it was. Luckily we had electricity, so there wasn't a time that we can't see. But yeah, you worked from early morning till late at night. And the purpose of the dining hall in those days, that's the one thing that I do not like, although I realize that probably the majority now do like. People said, well, what's the idea behind the dining hall? I said, that gives my moms a chance to be mom, because they don't have to spend their time cooking. Mm-hmm. They don't have to spend time grocery shopping, etc. All the cooking end of being mom, I get to provide, so they get to do the mom part of being mom. And I took that very seriously. And the other thing too is, as much as possible, I wanted every meal to be the kind that even if the kid didn't like what was served, he knew that I did the best possible job that I could do to help him get a meal. When I first started, it was a requirement that at least once a month we had to serve liver. And you had, as a kid, you had to eat liver. There was no getting around. You had to have a helping of liver. And I can still remember the first time I fixed liver. And I would say probably 5 out of 28 kids liked liver. And so whenever I knew liver was coming along, I went out of my way to make liver as palatable as you can make it, because I didn't like liver either. But at the same time, if it was a requirement, I was going to sit there and eat my chunk of liver if they had to. And so I can remember the first time I ever did it, I did the liver and onions like a lot of people do. I fixed it like chicken fried steak for some, and I fixed some with barbecue sauce. And I had one kid come up to me and after the first meal, and he said, "Uncle Woody, I hate liver, but as long as you fix it, I'll eat liver as long as I'm here." I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And you know, that was very important, that I wanted a kid to feel like it was worth me going out of my way so that life wasn't, at that instant, quite as bad for him as it could have been. Yeah. So yeah, there's just so many things that when we started, the old school way of thinking was that there are just things in life that you needed to learn how to endure. And liver and onions was one of those things. Spinach was another. Oh, I cannot look spinach in the face, even to this day. Now, I actually do like it in a salad, but back in those days, there was no such thing as having fresh spinach. You had all that stuff in the can.
Yeah.
And I always told everybody that they needed to pour it back in a cow because it wasn't fit to eat any more than cow manure was fit to eat. And so, but, you know, that sort of thing was expected. And the kids were taught, you know, life ain't fun. But you've got to be ready to meet it head on. But as much as I could, I always tried to do things to make it as acceptable as possible.
And I do remember your wife's snickerdoodles would be like, even if there was something I didn't want to eat, I knew that like if I ate it, then I would be able to eat that, and that was a big deal. That was
Mr. Anderson and I always said that when our working days at Cookson were done, we were going to fix Mom up in a factory that she was going to make ginger snaps, because her ginger snaps were the most fabulous things I've ever put in my mouth, and she did great ginger snaps. But yeah, I can remember all the bread, all the cinnamon rolls. The neatest part for me as a house parent, the neatest part for me, I can remember going home for my 25th class reunion and somebody asking me, "What do you do?" And I tried to explain as much as I could. And one of my classmates said, "I couldn't live like that." I said, "I couldn't live like you do." And he was wealthy. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I get 3 meals a day with my wife and kids. 7 days a week. I don't have to worry about my kids being somewhere that somebody they don't know is going to be walking up on them." I said, "I know that you're divorced and that your daughter is with your wife, and I've sat and listened to you talk, and you're miserable. I'll guarantee you, I would take my life the way I've had it with my kids to your life the way you've had it without your daughter, as many days as you want to offer me and as much money as you want to offer me, I would not trade you for nothing. My children, my place kids, as well as my biological kids, boy, that's what makes my heart beat. I realize, yeah, the Lord, but that's part of what the Lord gives.
Yeah.
And hopefully some of the kids that came through my dining hall had the idea, well, I'll get to go eat at Uncle Woody's dining hall, and so the day won't be a total loss.
Yeah.
And I've always felt like that's part of what I did. Because I had a lot of kids that would come to me and they'd be all mad at mom and dad because of, you know, hey, you know, let's just think about this for a minute. And it was so funny because they got to see Uncle Woody, the fun guy. One of the girls that Cynthia was in class with said, "Boy, I wish I lived in your house." And Cynthia, "No, you don't." "Oh, your dad's so much fun. I just, no, you wouldn't." Because she knew that the reason I was like I did was because in my house, the way I said it was the way it was going to happen. And she knew that girl too well enough to know that she would fight with me probably more than she was fighting with her house dad. But yeah, you know, life is, my daddy used to say, life is good if you don't weaken. And I always change that to say, life is good as long as you let Jesus be strong in it. Because I'm one that believes everything in there. There's no part of the Bible that I say, well, you can kind of move that one off to the side. There's some that, very frankly, don't affect me a whole lot, some of the teachings, because either I've already made them enough of a part of my life that I don't have to concentrate on them, or because of the times we live in, some of the things taught there don't apply. But the truth is still there. The reason behind the truth is still there. And so, yeah, as long as Jesus gets to be the strong part, I hurt for the rest of the people in the world who are, you know, the ones being persecuted, the ones being killed for their faith. I look at all this stuff going on right now, and these are scary times for a kid. And that's the thing that scares me right now the most, because even at the time you first came to Cookson, the way we had a system in place for the financial end of Cookson to be handled, a lot of that has to do with the philosophy of people who attended church at that time. But kids are not being raised to be givers. And everything in Christianity is give and share and look out for and protect. And, you know, all the things that we think of as just, those aren't being taught because there's no moms and dads in the home to teach them. And a lot of times it's grandmas and grandpas are tired.
Yeah.
It's all they can do to make sure that they got enough clothes and food and so forth to get to school and back each day. And so kids they're not even hearing about Jesus, much less being taught about Jesus. That's the scary part for the world and for any kid growing up in the world. And that's what places like Cookson were, and as far as I can tell, still are. But I'll talk about this until midnight if you want to, but I want to at least make sure that
Woody, as I would call you, but you can go ahead and introduce yourself how you would like to be called.
Well, I was Uncle Woody for 28 years at Cookson, so that's good enough for me.
All right.
Our story on that is, at least in my view, very unique, because when we went to work for Cookson, we got there on a Wednesday, and we started out in northwest Kansas at a place called Oberlin, and my wife, bless her heart, was about 23 years old. And that first weekend, they sent a couple boys to have us sit while another family was gone, and it turned out that when the people came back whose house they were in, they went back there for about 24 hours, and then they lived with us for the next 2 years. So, that was how quick we got, and we were cooks there, and we lived in the basement. The houses in northwest Kansas were on 2 levels because the winters were so bad at the time it began that they built the houses with an extra, I would call it a living room. And the downstairs, which they called the family room, was the area that, if you will, most of the living took place in. There was a living room upstairs, but it was a little more formal, and so on. But as a result, the dining hall was constructed somewhat the same way, but there was a apartment, a 3-bedroom apartment in the downstairs. And so our family was there, and the 2 boys moved into one of the bedrooms, and so we had them there for a couple of years, and then when they moved on, we ended up getting another one about, I don't know, 6 months or so later. And we were house parents to a group of children for about a year at one point, and then because we started out as cooks, and we were approached saying, we're having difficulty finding house parents, but you can't find good cooks, but we can find good cooks. Well, I found that was not a truth either, but at any rate, we went to house parenting. And that lasted 6 months to the day, and that cook left, and then we went back to the dining hall and took it over and remained there until we left. But back to the story, when we started with these 2 boys, one of them was 17 years old, and the other one was 15. My wife was 23. And in those days, there was a rule. You either called the parents in the house, mom and dad, and everybody else, Mr. and Mrs., when you were a child there. And those were the only ways that it was going to work. And my wife, bless her heart, introduced to the world the fact that Mrs. Watson was my mother. And she was not going to be Mrs. Watson. She would be Aunt Penny, but she would not be Mrs. Watson. And I don't know, I guess at that time Cookson had existed. We started in January of 1981, so Cookson started in 57. So what, about 30 some years, something like that, or 25, I guess. And so for the first time, it was legal, if you will, to have an aunt and uncle rather than Mr. and Mrs. And so we continued as Uncle Woody and Aunt Penny for the rest of our duration. I don't know whether anybody else ever became an official Uncle Woody and Aunt Penny.
Yeah.
I have no idea, but I know that it became so much a part of us that there were people my age and older that referred to us as Uncle Woody and Aunt Penny. So that's how it started and how it continued. And I'm now grandpa, and I have people here in town that will sometimes call me grandpa, because to me, Cookson is all about family.
It is, and I like that. I like that you introduce something new, because they already have a mom and dad, and they might not necessarily feel comfortable using that, and so that seems more familiar, like family, but not like you're trying to replace. That's already there. I like that's unique.
And we had one boy who lived with us, probably the last placement we got, and his parents were in the process of a nasty divorce, and he did not want to face that, and he was doing everything he could to avoid calling us mom and dad, because he was in denial, I guess, that he was losing his mom and dad. Yeah. And I made the suggestion at the time. I said, it's okay with me. Why don't we just stay with Uncle Woody and Aunt Penny? And the counselor for him said, no, this is something he needs to face, that his mom and dad are not ever going to get back together. And so they wouldn't allow that, and he was later on, I don't know how comfortable he ever got with the idea, but he did call us mom and dad, and it became more of a casual accepted thing on his behalf. But I've always liked the idea of aunts and uncles, and because in church we always talk about that we're brothers and sisters in Christ. Yeah. That in one sense, if we take it literal, the Bible says no man should be called father, because we have a heavenly Father. And dad, that makes sense. And at the same time, we need to be family. And I don't know, to me, the need for family is more so now than I've ever seen it. I look around what's going on in the world, and people are hungry for family, whether they're blood family or not. And I love the role. I went to work here in town at one of the places, and I just adopted all the kids there. Our youngest, her name is Ellie, and the first boy that we had when we moved to Oklahoma, still we are very close with those two. Yeah. We get together with them for family gatherings, etc. And I tell everybody that we have 4 children. We have 2 biological children and 2 children who adopted us. There's nothing legal about it. Yeah. But they decided we were mom and dad, and we're going to continue to be mom and dad. And so I love that. We need to adopt. Yeah. We need to adopt parents. My parents were 400 miles away. My wife's parents have not been in the picture for years. And you remember Grandma and Grandpa Crawford? Yes. Well, we just felt like Grandma and Grandpa Crawford were mom and dad. And they were always Grandma and Grandpa to our kids. And a lot of kids called them Grandma and Grandpa, it wasn't just ours. But we just always promoted Grandma Wilkinson. Yeah. Is Grandma, and how many kids on the place I don't think you probably ever met, but you know, Granny Groover. You hear people talk about Granny Groover, and you know, Grandpa Moody.
Yeah. Everybody's right.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And to me, that's how it needs to work. If they're old enough to be your grandpa, call them grandpa. There's nothing written anywhere that says that you get two sets of grandparents.
True.
Don't need it.
And I completely understand. There's so many that I call sisters still,
Yeah.
and brother, like
Yeah.
that we're still very close,
Yeah.
regardless of blood.
Yeah. And that's how it needs to be, especially at this time. I tell my kids, I tell my in-town kids, hey, if you need me, call. If you need me to come over and take you because you got to go pick up your car because it's in the shop, just call and say, hey, can you get, yeah. Because that's what dads do. That's what grandpas do. But especially now, it was bad enough back when you were growing up. But especially now, there's just so many families in which, at best, you've got one parent in the home. And so there needs to be plenty of adults who are willing to step up and say, yeah, I'll be your dad. Yeah, I'll be your mom.
It takes a village.
Well, it's not just that it takes a village. It takes a heart that says, I'm available.
Yeah.
That I like to tell people that Jesus said, go. Last thing, you know, read the Great Commission. Go. Where? In all the world. Show them me. The parable of the Good Samaritan. What did Jesus do in the lives of every one of us? We were beaten up. We were thrown down. We were left for dead. Jesus came along. And if you look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's Jesus with every one of us. He's getting ready to go to heaven. He turns around to his followers and he said, hey guys, go show them me. Go, go, go. Don't sit on your butt and wait for somebody to show up. And that's where we dropped the ball, I think. But I'm getting you off the point.
No, it's okay. It's okay. What brought you to Cookson in the first place?
I'm not kidding when I say the Lord. And I mean very, very specifically. Before I was a Christian, my first year of teaching school, in those days, it was called the Missouri State Reformatory for Girls. It was a, if you will, detention center. They referred to it back then as a kids' prison. All girls, 12-month school. They had been sentenced by a judge. They were incarcerated when they were not doing things outside of their room. They were not put in a cell, but they were put in a totally locked down room. Most of the time they had a roommate, unless they were just really very difficult to deal with, and then they were in there by themselves. But it was the average age of the girls that were there was about 15. And I had a little girl that had been in my class, and her name was Roberta. And Roberta, her time was up and she went home. And about 6 weeks later, we hear Roberta's coming back. Her home life was terrible. She went home and intentionally did something in front of a cop, so she'd get arrested,
Yeah.
get violated, and be sent back. And I can still remember the day that I first saw her, and I remind you again, I was not a Christian. I wanted nothing to do with God in those days, but he wanted something to do with me. And I can still remember standing on the front steps of the school, and she had been sent over by somebody else to do something because, well, the next phrase will answer the reason. She came up the steps of the school, and I said, well, Roberta, I'm sorry for the circumstances, but it's good to see you. And she said, Mr. Watson, it's good to be back home. And that broke my heart. Because when you are locked in a room, you're told when you can come out, you're told when you can go eat, you're told when to stand up and when to sit down at meal times. When you're told you go here, and if you don't, you get locked up, and you call that home, there's something wrong somewhere. And so when Penny and I were married, and my parents had taken a load of clothes from the church that they were attending down here to Cookson, and they were impressed with the place. Their preacher was brother to Dr. Pummel, and that was one of the reasons why their church was supporting us. And they were just totally impressed. And they started telling me about Cookson. And I could just never get out of my mind that I needed, because of Roberta, and that's how God planted it. Wood, you got to do something. And I talked to Penny. She was on board with the idea. Never as gung-ho as I, which is okay.
Yeah.
But we had read a story in a Reader's Digest about a little boy whose mother and boyfriend, he was 5 years old, and the mom was much more interested in the boyfriend than the child. And by neglect and abuse, they killed him. And that broke Penny's heart. And I can still remember us sitting in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen on a Sunday night, because we were working a graveyard shift at one of the restaurants.
Yeah.
Sitting before we went to work, we were sitting in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen, and we just prayed and said, Lord, we want you to send us to the kids that you want us to take care of. I still remember that prayer, just as vivid as looking at you. And the next day, we called Cookson. We had checked into other places,
Yeah.
but I told Penny, I said, well, we'll look and see what this place is about. And called, and Mr. Gorman at that time was the director, and he said, come on down. We came down and met him. The first night we stayed, well, the first night we were there as guests, we stayed with the Langstons. And they were staying where, or they were living where Reeves and later on Clary's lived in the house there across from the basketball court on the 920, the middle house of those three. And we stayed there, but it was kind of interesting because they knew that I had at one time managed a Kentucky Fried Chicken. and had quite a bit of work in food service. And so we had applied to be house parents, and I called them later, and they said, we don't have any place for you here, but that we do have a location in Oberlin, Kansas, and they're in need of somebody to run the dining hall there. Would that interest you? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, we'll have the director from there come talk to you. And I don't know, a week later, Mr. Dunn came and interviewed us, and he said, well, I'll go back and talk with people and we'll pray about it, and we'll let you know. And he left. He had eaten supper with us. At that time, Cynthia was only about 15 months old. And I tell everybody that she's the reason why we were hired, because Penny was at work and Cynthia was staying at my mom's when Mr. Dunn showed up, because I was working the graveyard shift, she was working the day shift, and so I was getting some sleep. And he showed up, and we had talked for 30 minutes or so, and Penny came, and she had Cynthia with her, and the door opened. Cynthia walked in just like she was Queen of England, and because that was her place. And I said, Cynthia, this is Mr. Dunn. Can you say hi to Mr. Dunn? She walked over, climbed up on his lap, put her arms around his neck, and gave him a kiss. And I told everybody we were hired from that moment, because that just melted his heart. And so he called us back later that night and said, we're going to hire you. So in January in 1981, we started. And when we spent 4.5 years there, 2.5 years at Alba, which is north of Joplin. And then we moved to Oklahoma and been here ever since. But it was just one of those things that the Lord took us on a journey. And in that amount of years, we've been through a lot. Good, bad, heartwarming, heartbreaking. Wouldn't trade a minute of it. I was not happy when they decided that we would leave. But the Lord knows a whole lot better. And it was time. We couldn't face it, and had troubles for 2 or 3 years after getting our hearts. But the Lord had things here for us to do, and so looking back on it now, it's the best thing that happened at that age. But no, Cookson was. I very frankly wouldn't want to be there now the way it is, but the way it was in the old days, this old geezer could handle the old days. I couldn't handle the new days. Just like I think the majority of the house parents there probably couldn't handle the old days, but they settled in with the new days.
Could you give some examples of like how it's different?
Philosophy, I think, I never ever had a single child come live with me that I had the idea, no matter what I was told, that child would not live with us until he was ready to go out on his own. Now, I realized that the truth was that wasn't the plans of anybody else. But my thought is, no, I signed on to Cookson for life. I never had any intention. In fact, when the idea was presented to us, the idea was you start with us, you work until you get to be retirement age. At that point, because see, when we started, we were in the first month, I'll have you know, that Penny and I were, for the first time, everybody at Cookson got a raise. and every adult was making $125 a month before Social Security. And so that translated to $3,000 a year for the couple before Social Security. And they said, you work for us that way. When you get to retirement age, you go on Social Security. That's a raise, because in those days, people basic Social Security was about $425. Well, you know, that just beats the fire out of 125.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and 6 months before I turned retirement age, they said, no, you're going. But it's okay, because the Lord has provided for us. You know, I keep telling people that the reason you know that Cookson is the Lord's is because if a lot of people don't know it, but the Lord puts adults at Cookson the same as He puts kids at Cookson. I can remember Grandma McDaniel making a statement. A lot of times she'd say, you know, there's some kids that come to Cookson because the Lord puts them there, and there's lots of adults that come to Cookson because the Lord puts them there. And over the years, there were some that sneaked in because the devil sneaked them in, and that was not a good thing. But the Lord weeded them out too. And so, as far as I was concerned, it was for life. And the reason I decided it was because Cookson said, if you get to be retirement age, you just go on Social Security, keep right on working. You can still go to the food store. You can still, you know, get your lights paid. We'll find some place to put you. And that's why the apartments were built originally. I think they built the apartments 2 or 3 years after we started. And so as a result, we went to Cookson with the idea that we'll die there. Yeah. So that changes your whole mindset. We always told Ellie, because Ellie came to live with us when she was 6, and she graduated from high school and went on to college from there. And we always told her, you're a keeper. Your last name may not be Watson, but to us, you're Watson. And so you're gonna, when you get older and you get married and have kids and it's time to take them to see Grandma and Grandpa, this is where you come, as far as we're concerned. If you change your mind, that's up to you. But you just need to know that we're in this for the long haul. And I had that feeling about every kid that came there, that I needed to be prepared to be the grandparent to their kids someday. That I needed to be prepared for a phone call that says, Dad, this is driving me up the tree. What can I do? Well, the first thing is you bring them and leave them with me for a few days. You know, I'll have some grandpa time. You know, I could envision that clear back then. And that's the way, in those days, I heard lots of people say, because someone would say, how long is he going to be there? Oh, probably at least until he's 18. And he can go out on his own. We had a few that stayed past 18th birthday. And they got worked out into society.
See, when we left, they had to leave when they turned 18. So that might have changed.
Well, the majority of them couldn't wait to get out. Yeah. Superman's cape didn't stick out any more than their shirt tail did when they turned 18 and had the chance to go. You know, most of them wanted to be away from there. But our son Kirk, that lived with us and graduated from high school there, and he now lives in Kansas City, has 3 grown daughters. he loved it. He didn't want to go. And it's just so neat when a kid gets there and he's in a family situation and he looks around and it settles in on him and he goes, I'm home. And it has nothing to do with the house.
Yeah.
It has all to do with the, and that's what we wanted to do with every kid that came. Another big difference between then and now, I am happy that when we started, not only did we get a raise, but in the state of Kansas, they passed a law you can't spank. And while that was very upsetting to a lot of the old-timer house parents, because that was another thing as to the kind of kid we got. There were a lot of kids that were placed with Cookson, even after we started, that a judge says, you got your choice. You can go to prison,
Yeah.
or you can go to Cookson Hills. And when you get that kid, he doesn't come in and say, hi everybody, I'm happy to be here. And sometimes I can remember hearing it said by a number of people that you knew you had a good house dad because he could outfight the three biggest boys in his house, and had to. Well, that worked to some degree back then.
Yeah.
But in this day and age, that don't work. And so that's another reason why I don't fit in, because even though I have never had the idea that, I wanted the ability and the right and so forth to be able to put a switch to them, in this day and age, under normal circumstances, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I tell people that I always had the philosophy. And in fact, I told one of the boys in my house one time, I said, you need to understand, I love you enough, I'll go to prison for you.